title of this first webinar is Interpreting Dietary Guidelines. My name is Maria Hassapidou, and I'm a professor of nutrition and dietetics in the Alexandra Technological Education Institute of Thessaloniki. So another problem, Judith, I have is that I don't know how I can go on to the next slide because it does not work.
Oh, it should work just the same as a PowerPoint?
Yeah, but it doesn't work because I'm trying to go to the next slide and it doesn't. And I cannot go back either. That's not very good. I'm very sorry.
So am I. I'm sorry. I don't know how to help with that.
Pause. I will say pause showing my screen to make sure that probably saw the control. I'm so sorry about that. I cannot find a way to do it because even with escape it doesn't go back.
Oh.
No, it only shows the first screen and nothing else. The first slide. It doesn't change the screen. I just put show my screen again, just in case.
And you can't come out of PowerPoint and go back in?
No, I cannot. Oh. No, I cannot.
Oh dear.
No, I don't know. It's a little bit confusing. With escape, it doesn't go. Let's try something else. No. Let's try the PowerPoint, but not again. Maybe. Ah, okay. I found a way to do it.
Good.
Can you just see the second slide now?
Yes.
Sorry about that.
And everyone else can hear us because some people have typed to say yes, they can hear us. So everyone's listening. Off you go.
Okay, great. Sorry about that, but this is a very new system for me, and I'm very, very confused. Anyway, I go back and say that I'm going to talk about interpreting dietary guidelines, and I should start by saying that a balanced diet is one that provides adequate amounts of energy and nutrients for health and well-being. And we have the dietary guidelines, or the dietary reference values, as we call them, the DRVs, that they're nutrient-based recommendations. That means they're based on our needs on nutrients. So what are the DRVs are doing? They aim to ensure that we have sufficient intakes, we get enough from energy and essential nutrients. And these DRVs are given in different groups, first of all, according to sex and age, and secondly, in different groups of people that they're having chronic diseases. So we have DRVs for healthy individuals and DRVs for chronic diseases. So we can see here what we call the population reference intake, which is at this point, and this is the point where we have the average requirement, and here is the point that we have what we call the population reference intake. That means that the population reference intake is the adequate reference intake, which is the average, and we go here, this is -2 standard deviation, this is the average requirement, this is the lower threshold, and this is the population reference intake. I'm not sure you can see my screen now, but anyway, the population reference intake is the average intake plus 2 standard deviation. And the lower threshold intake is a level of intake below which, on the basis of current knowledge, almost all individuals will have an adequate intake. So talking about DRVs, we have 3 points. Lower threshold intake, average requirement, and population reference intake. So usually what we're using is this value. Okay, so when we're talking about needs of a population, we're talking about this value. And we also have 2 more values. One is the tolerable upper intake level, okay, here. And we have the reference intake ranges for micronutrients. What is the tolerable upper intake level? Is the maximum level of chronic daily intake of nutrients, unlikely to have adverse health effects. And we also have the reference intake ranges for micronutrients that they expressed as a proportion of daily average intakes. For example, we say we have to take you have to have a dietary fat intake of 20 to 35% of total daily energy intake. So we also have these 2 values. So this is what we are saying, what is the important values we have for DRVs. But let's see some examples of DRVs to make it more clear. For example, here we have the nutrient requirements of the British Nutrition Foundation, and they are published in 2015. And here you can see what I think it's well known to all dietitians, but it's a typical example of tables, reference nutrient intakes, for example, for vitamins. Here we have thiamine, we have riboflavin, we have niacin, vitamin 6, and here we have the needs according to age and according to sex. We have males and females, and then we have, for example, for pregnant women and for lactating women. So this is a very good example of DRVs. And here we have DRVs again from the British Nutrition Foundation for the different minerals, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, etc. It's the same as the vitamins, but this is for the minerals. So what we have the DRVs, as I explained before, for the healthy individuals. So for the healthy individuals, we have the DRVs, all these values show you for the different age groups. And we also have recommendations for the disease, for the different diseases. This is an example from the recommendation for diabetes from ADA 2006. And we can see, for example, that we have a diabetic patient. What we say, for example, that he has to have, I don't know, 45 to 65% from carbohydrates in his daily diet as a percentage of energy. We can have the calories per gram, or we have a recommendation for protein and fat. So this is a typical example of DRVs for a specific disease, for example, diabetes. Now, on one hand, we have the DRVs, or the DRIs, as we call them as well, or the PRIs, as we also call them. They are the same. They are the recommended dietary intakes. But these are recommendations based on nutrients. On the other hand, we also have recommendations that are based on food. This is what we call food-based dietary guidelines. And these are very important also because individuals choose foods for their diet and not nutrients. Thus, we would say that food-based dietary guidelines are the interpretation of the nutrient-based recommendations. So when we're talking about interpreting recommendations, scientists start with the nutrient-based recommendations, and then we translate them or we interpret them as food-based dietary guidelines. So food-based dietary guidelines, they provide an advice on foods, food groups, and dietary patterns. So these are the messages, I would say, the simple messages that as dietitians we have to give to the general public on healthy eating in order to promote the overall health and prevent the chronic diseases. So the food-based dietary guidelines give an indication of what a person should be eating in terms of foods rather than nutrients. So we avoid the use of numerical recommended intake of nutrients, but we provide a very practical way of interpreting the numerical recommendations into dietary advice. So it focuses on foods that are consumed commonly in portion sizes and in behaviors. So what is happening? Most countries have the DRIs, the DRVs, but they also have developed, more than 100 countries worldwide, they have developed food-based dietary guidelines. And what is the good about the food-based dietary guidelines that each country is developing is that these guidelines are adapted to their nutrition situation, to their food availability, their culinary cultures, and their eating habits. And what is also interesting is that most countries have furthermore developed a graphic representation of the food-based dietary guidelines in order to illustrate the proportions of different foods that should be included in a balanced diet. So it's interesting, and we'll see it in a minute, that we have graphic representations like food pyramid, food plates, and we'll see some more later on. So the use of these food groups makes sure that all the basic foods are included, and they give some positive messages about what we should be eating, as well as some information to help us avoid eating too much of certain foods. And although the food-based dietary guidelines, are, as you are going to see in a minute, are different in each country, we would say that they all have some common characteristics. They all promote the variety and increased consumption of plant foods, especially fruits and vegetables, eating protein foods, eating food rich in carbohydrates, but especially dietary fiber. And they all give the advice for the reduction or the reduced intake of solid fats, salt and sugar. But what is the difference between each different recommendation depending on the country? They have a set of dietary guidelines that contain unique features to address the dietary needs of each country's population. And this is very important. Sometimes they include other aspects of lifestyle, like physical activity or eating regular meals. And occasionally they even have advice on food hygiene. So let's see this, some example of these food-based dietary guidelines for the general population in different countries. It's interesting to see this graphical representation. For example, Australia has a wheel to represent the healthy eating. Germany has a nutrition pyramid. And you see it's interesting to see the different sides of the pyramid. Greece also has a pyramid for the Mediterranean diet. But of course, these pyramids are not the same because Greece is based, for example, on the Mediterranean diet. But they have the same, let's call it graphical representation as a pyramid. You can also see the Italian pyramid. It's interesting to see that Japan has a food guide spinning top. It's like a spinning guide. Of course, most of us know that the UK has the Eat Well plate, and we can see in the plate the recommendation: fruit, vegetables, bread, potatoes, pasta, meat, and how, if we have a plate, how we're going to divide our plate, and what are the dietary recommendations represented as a plate. And of course, we also have the United States My Plate. And you can see that Turkey has a 4-leaf clover. And you can see some other interesting models. For example, China has a dietary pagoda. The Netherlands has a wheel of 5, and Canada has a rainbow. I don't know the nationalities of the attendees today, but probably you will find your own recommendations in this graphical representation, depending on which country you're coming from. So, as I said before, although we have different models, the guidelines, if you look at them, and the recommendations are very similar. They're all based on the following recommendations: eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, eat plenty of starchy foods including breads, potatoes, rice and pasta, have a moderate intake of foods of animal origin, choose more fish, choose less fatty meat, choose healthy oils, limit the intake of foods that are rich in fat and sugar, and drink enough fluids. For example, they all stress the idea of we have to eat plenty of fruits and vegetables, and you can see a graphical representation from different guidelines. Most of the recommendations, they talk about fruits and vegetables, for example, the idea of eat 5 a day, and they give some idea of what counts as a portion. And we can also see different leaflets or different recommendations from different countries. For example, this is from the BDA, and also except the graphical representation, there are some leaflets that explain the recommendations, and they're given to different parts of the population. Most of the recommendation, they are talking about the idea of you have to limit the intake of foods that are rich in and very high in fat and sugar. And again, we have a lot of recommendation that they are talking about lowering salt intake. What we should also say, and it's important to stress, is that the food-based dietary recommendation in most countries, they are also given according to age group. That means that we have different recommendations for different age groups. For example, we have recommendation for infants, we have recommendation for children and adolescents. In some countries, they are divided. We have different recommendations for children and different for adolescents. We have adults and we have the elderly. And you can see some very good examples of different examples from Europe mainly, of dietary recommendation from children. For example, these are the Greek dietary recommendations, the most recent ones that they are talking about dietary guidelines for children. They were published from the Ministry of Health. These are also from Greece. This is for the very young children for the first semester of life, and they're giving recommendation to the mother for the breastfeeding, exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months, and then how we introduced the feeding in the first year. Again, in most of these recommendations, you can see that they are giving some pictures to help either the mother or the child, or for example, these ones are for the children, but they also have similar recommendations. This is for young adults and adolescents, what they should have in the plate, what is a portion, but we also have similar recommendation in most countries for adults as well. And then, as I said before, we also have nutrient-based recommendation. And in most guidelines, in most countries, you can find both. You can find, for example, a leaflet that has recommendations that are food-based, and probably at the end of this leaflet, they're also giving the recommendation for the different age groups. You can see here it's for children. And this is mainly used by the health professionals. So as dietitians, we need to know both. We need to know the nutrient-based recommendation, but as I said, we need to know the food-based recommendation, because this will help us a lot with our patients. Again, here we can see macronutrient recommendation. I'm going to go through all that, but this is an example for the Greek recommendation. But then we can see similar recommendation for other European countries. This we have the United States. This is, I'm still talking about children. Again, representing different portions for children, and at the end of this recommendation, they also have, as I said, the nutrient-based recommendation. Again, this is minerals. And here again, as I said, we do have recommendation. This is again, I'm using my own country recommendation here for Greece, but you can see the Turkey, the recommendation for Turkey. You can see the Australian. You can see here recommendations from the Nordic countries. So here you find both, as I said, the nutrient-based and the food-based recommendation for adults this time. So we do divide them, as I said, for children and for adults. And here you can see that we have specific recommendations that you can use in your own country for elder people. So for you as practitioners, it's very important to have all these recommendations for your own country, to find them according to age group, and and to also find the nutrient-based recommendation in your country and the food-based recommendation. So as a practitioner, as I said, you need to have both. Again, you can see in different countries recommendation for special meals, for different meals. For example, you can find recommendation for breakfast. And again, and in this way, we can say that we cover the recommendation for the healthy individuals. But at the same time, we have recommendation for chronic diseases. Again, I will show you some examples of food-based dietary recommendation for chronic diseases. For example, we have the diabetes mellitus. We have our patients with diabetic patients, and then we need to know some recommendations regarding diabetes. So these are some very general recommendations, but they talk about a diet that's going to be low in saturated fat. We know that we have to have 5 portions of fruit and vegetables, and we know that we have the moderate use of alcohol. So these are, I would say, the general recommendations for diabetes. We have recommendations for cardiovascular diseases from different organizations. You may have your own recommendation in your own country, but maybe you want to find out the recommendation that we have, for example, from the EFAD, the American Heart Association, or the British Heart Association, or maybe your local association, or your local diabetes association. For example, in Greece, we have the Greek Diabetes Association, that gives the general dietary recommendation, but the difference is, again, as I said, for the healthy individual, that they take into account the local circumstances, the local food habits. Again, for hypertension, we all know the DASH diet, and some of us, we use it in our own country, or some of us, we have the DASH diet, let's say, changed or adapted is the best word in our local food habits. You can see the DASH diet. It is also from the UK Healthcare. And you can see, and you can use the DASH diet, for example, if you have one of your patients has hypertension, and then you can show this, and you can say, for example, you have to discuss with him how many portions from grains or from vegetables he's going to eat in order to help him with his disease. And again, people with high cholesterol. So again, you can hear the general recommendations here, that they come from different European associations. For example, or it could be either a European association, or I said it could be either one of your national association, and in this case, probably sometimes it's better because it is adapted in your local food habits. You can see here again cholesterol lowering plan. And finally, because I need to give you some time to ask questions, I hope we managed to do that. I would like to tell you a few words about what we are doing now regarding dietary guidelines for obesity. What we are trying to do is to try and have the European dietary guidelines for obesity. We do know, and we could have a webinar for that, specialized on obesity, a webinar specialized on dietary recommendation for obesity, where I was going to tell you what I already said for the previous diseases, that each country probably has their own dietary recommendation. But we thought that it's a good idea for all dietitians to have some European dietary guidelines for obesity, that they could be used all over Europe. So what we're doing now, ESO, with the European Association for the Study of Obesity, together with the European Federation of the Association of Dietitians, our EFAD, they have established a joint nutrition working group in order to assess the availability, quality, and use of national dietary guidelines, as we can do with other diseases as well in the future, of course, with the aim to develop and disseminate evidence-based best practice European dietary guidelines and lifestyle guidelines for the management of obesity in both adults and children. So we do hope that we're going to have these European dietary guidelines for you, the dietitians, so you will be able to use them all over Europe. We are planning to have this as a two-track approach. With track one will be the development of guidelines for adults. This is going to be, we hope we're going to have it ready by the end of 2017. And then from 2017 to 2019, we're hoping to develop guidelines specific for the needs of children and families. And we are hoping that this will help us dietitians all over Europe to be able to tackle a big problem of obesity in children and adults. And we're hoping in the future that we're going to work in the same way for the other diseases that we have we confront as dietitians, for example, hypertension or hypercholesterolemia or diabetes. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry if it was not, if you couldn't see very well or you couldn't listen very well. This was my first try for a webinar. I hope our future webinars will be better. Thank you very much. I don't know if you can listen to me now. Can you listen to me?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, great.
I can.
So how can we have questions?
Maybe a question, Maria. You're talking about dietary guidelines, and those are, of course, based for groups of people, on for a large number of people. What can you say something about the use by dietitians for individual patients or clients?
Oh, yes, this is a very good question. Thank you. Because what we try to do here is to see how what guidelines are available, okay, and the different categories, Of course, if you want to individualize your work, and we have to individualize your work, you need to know the dietary guidelines, of course, and you need to use them to advise your patient using dietary guidelines. But they can help you, for example, the nutrient-based guidelines, they can help you more to individualize your work, because what you're doing, you're getting all the information for your patient, and then you want to see, for example, if what they consume or what you're advising them to consume are covering their needs. For example, using the nutrient-based guidelines. For example, you go to these tables I showed you before, and you have a child and you want to see if they cover their thiamine intake. So you can use the nutrient-based guidelines for individualized diets. You can also use the food-based guidelines if you want to have, again, a child in front of you and you want to, for example, the child to lose weight, and you want to show him or her and the parents what foods they should eat or what foods they should avoid.
Okay, does anyone else have a question? At the moment, everyone is muted again to improve the sound quality, and you should be able to select the question button so that I can see that you have your hand raised, and then I can unmute you so you can speak. Or you can type in the chat box. Any more questions? I don't see any questions coming in. Okay, well, in that case, I think, Maria, thank you very much for the presentation, for the webinar. I'm so glad we managed to make it work. Apologies to everyone for the slow start. And thank you very much. It has been recorded, so we will post it on the EFAD website so people can listen to it after the event as well if they wish to.